Hi there. As you know, I'm Daniel Kirsch, and today we're going to be discussing once again the presidency, and in specific, we're going to talk about that aspect of the presidency that everybody thinks they know a lot about, but very few people actually do. And that is, of course, the presidential selection process. Now, if this is not entirely clear on the board behind me, I apologize, but I will be going through each and every point so that you will be able to use this for reference later. The first thing I want to mention is that I don't intend for this to be a comprehensive substitute for the textbook, but rather a complement. And I want you to think of this, especially for your paper, but also for class participation, more as a research guide than as a lecture, a definitive lecture on the important facts that you need to know. So in that spirit, I have listed here the kind of 4 consequential presidential elections that I expect you to know. I think you should be expected to know backwards and forwards in terms of how the presidency has evolved in terms of especially the nomination process. So to start off, we have 1824, and of course the Crawford selection by the caucus system. And I won't be elaborating on these things, but I want you to be able to kind of recall them and explain them yourself during class, as well as be able to make them fit into your paper rather seamlessly. So 1824, you should know, 1912, and the basically the pioneering aspects of Teddy Roosevelt's candidacy in terms of the primary system, and how he was able to form a new party as a result of his basically being cheated out of the presidential election in 1912. But then in the long term, ultimately, that was not successful. 1968, and this is kind of being blunt about this, but the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, demonstrating the importance of the primary system in terms of an independent candidacy that is popular is going to be very effective during the presidential nomination process in the modern era. But unfortunately, after his death, we have a party that is struggling to find a standard bearer, and they end up choosing someone who agrees not at all with one of the fundamental issues of the campaign, and that is the Vietnam War. He agrees not at all with, I should say, the base of the Democratic Party at the time, which was so anti-war. They had 2 anti-war candidates leading with the vast majority of votes, Robert F. Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy. And McCarthy, having been kind of soundly defeated during that primary process by Kennedy, he just simply wasn't able to come back. And so Humphrey became the epicenter of a lot of criticism, and was one of the reasons why the 1968 campaign was so fraught with violence, one of the reasons anyway, especially at the Democratic Convention where he was nominated after having not competed in the process. So soon after, they reformed the process so that the voters had more of a say in the nomination process, but they kept the idea of some delegates being able to vote their free will. And in 2016, that seemed to matter quite a bit more, as the superdelegates loomed very large in the Democratic Party's process. And superdelegates are just those delegates who can attend the Democratic National Convention and vote for the party's nominee, not having been sent there as a delegate for any one candidate. They're simply there because they are usually retired or distinguished public officials, meaning they're former members of Congress or current members of Congress and or governors and state officials and retired people of that sort. So all of those things you should know sort of about the significance of the development of the party process, as well as the party nomination process, as well as, you know, what happened in 2016 in terms of who was nominated and who was not. And I think that'll become clear with some of the other key terms that I put up here as with the example using the 2016 campaign. And the reason the 2016 campaign is so attractive is because it was wide open on both sides. There simply was not an established candidate that was inevitably going to take the nomination in either case. So there's no incumbent. Joe Biden was the closest thing to a kind of a vice presidential possibility running for president. He did not that year. And Hillary Clinton was seen to be the kind of party establishment candidate to carry on the Obama administration's policies. And she was also a very established name in her own right. And Jeb Bush, I believe, older brother, if I'm not mistaken, of George W. Bush, and he was and son, of course, of George H.W. Bush. He had raised $100 million, which is far and away the largest total I can remember in recent memory of a presidential candidate who was not the incumbent running for the nomination in the year before the nomination contest began. So he seemed to be the prohibitive favorite. However, in that invisible primary in 2016, more than money mattered. Media mattered. Media in the sense that in terms of the not only the ads that a candidate would run, but the free media, the kind of publicity that a candidate would receive from news media. And that publicity, there's definitely a lot of studies out there, one that I'll send to you that I believe Media Matters conducted, and it was simply a counting of the minutes in 2015 focused on any one presidential campaign, and Donald Trump's received exponentially more coverage than any other presidential campaign. And part of that was, at least at the beginning, fascination with his sort of celebrity status and the fact that he'd run for president. And also the fact that they didn't think it would affect anything, because they ultimately believed that he was not a serious candidate. He hadn't raised any money. He had never had public office before. He had never been elected to anything. And everything that he was saying was so far beyond the traditional scope of political rhetoric that they didn't think it would catch on in any meaningful way. And it did not. Those predictions, that analysis by really the entire media apparatus did not bear fruit. And in fact, after the initial primaries began, it became very clear that Trump was the prohibitive favorite in Iowa, New Hampshire, and all the rest of the states. However, Hillary Clinton had a very long, drawn-out battle with Bernie Sanders for the nomination, and she ended up winning this time. More, and it was certainly as close as it was, or roughly as close as it was, in 2008 when she ran against Barack Obama and ultimately didn't win that race. But this time she was able to win, and Bernie Sanders, I think, similarly to Trump in at least one respect, he wasn't taken seriously either at the beginning. He declared his candidacy in March in front of a few reporters, but then his campaign really caught on, especially with younger generations. I would say Generation X and millennial voters ended up really turning out for him in the first several states. He ended up winning the New Hampshire primary, and he very narrowly lost Iowa to Hillary Clinton, but the fact that she didn't beat him by 50 points, but rather by more like 2 or 3 points, I think really caught people's attention. And so the invisible primary that I want to talk about first is the time that money and media matters before any of the initial contests take place. And that ends up really determining what is called viability, and viability really has two definitions. They're both the same type. One, the overall word is just how strong is your campaign? How much do you think you'll actually be able to compete in the election? And the other is a very technical definition of in the Iowa caucus that I want you to look up. It's whether your candidate will make it to the second round in the caucus, even though you may be a voter that turned out there in order to vote for a specific candidate. If they don't meet a percentage threshold, they're not going to be able to make it to that second round, so they won't get any votes. But that's something to be clarified probably during class and certainly in your book. horse race coverage is, and I realize these transitions are short and maybe non-existent, but again, I really have to highlight this in a very truncated way. Horse race coverage is something that you should know the definition of. It's simply what the media does. They cover who's up and who's down, and the reason I'm able to kind of recall all of this really quickly, as I'm sure many of you are too, is because it's all the media talked about, and the entire media narrative of the campaign was personality driven. But I do have a few statistics that I want to bring up to you that I think will be interesting to explore, especially in the case of Iowa and New Hampshire. Now, the horse race coverage is especially bad in those two states because all we talk about for the year leading up to the Iowa caucus is who's leading in Iowa, who's leading in New Hampshire. And one question that I think is a fair question for an essay is certainly, why do we have Iowa and New Hampshire first? And I think I don't need to say more than that. I think your book talks quite a bit about it, and I don't expect you to bring in outside resources, but the prospects maybe for reforming Iowa and New Hampshire and making them not first or making them just another state in the rotation is worth talking about as well. And during Super Tuesday, there are several types of primaries, and the three that I need you to know are caucus, open primary, and closed primary. Those are the three main types of primaries. Caucus is not an election properly, but it's sort of like a survey, but it's a self-selecting survey. It's people go to a series of high school gyms, for example, and other meeting spaces throughout a state, and instead of voting, they go there to cast their support in public for people. And it sounds a lot more like what voting used to be, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But in Iowa, there's some footage I'm going to link to, and that footage is going to show you just how hand-to-hand it is, like how much retail campaigning is involved in Iowa campaigning. And if you go and you're an Obama person, for example, or you're a Clinton person, or you're a Sanders person, in the Democratic Party, you go and you pledge your support and you literally stand with other people and trying to get as many people in the high school gym to your corner as possible. And if you don't get as many people as possible or enough people to make it to the second round, you're considered not viable. And so then all of you need to go towards some other camp for the second round. And that's how the Iowa caucus works. New Hampshire and the Republican Party, it's exactly the opposite. There's no retail campaigning. It's just you go, and the Iowa caucus was really established by the Democratic Party. The Republicans basically just answered it with, we'll hold our own caucus, and they go, and it's very interesting to see the two sides. The Republicans sit down in chairs in rows, and they have speakers. And then people basically write down on a piece of paper who their support is for, and they pass it to the end of the row, and they're collected and tabulated at the front. Easy peasy. And so they're very different parties, and I think that may be emblematic of a lot of other aspects of their kind of tendencies and organizational proclivities. So in terms of Super Tuesday, there are a lot of different kinds of caucuses and primaries that are held. One of them is the open primary, and the open primary is just where anyone can vote, regardless of party, for a party's nominee. And a closed primary is just the opposite. It's where a closed electorate, basically only party members can vote. And in New York, it's so closed, the primary, that for example, in 2016, you would have had to register as a Democrat by something like October 1st of 2015 to be able to vote in April of 2016. So 6 months before. And so that's the party rules. And so in that state, even though Sanders was winning independents and first-time voters and younger voters, all three of those sectors were basically closed out of the 2016 election in New York And so it should come as no surprise that Clinton won that state by 57 to 43. So it's not, I don't think it's, so in that case, rules matter because you're not measuring apples to apples, really. You're measuring, you know, how can one compete in sort of the shifting sands of presidential election rules. And then one thing you should know about the difference, again, between the Democratic and Republican parties in terms of how they collect support in terms of the party nomination. The unit rule is the rule that all of a party's votes go basically towards, all the party's state votes, as long as you win the most votes in a party's primary, all of your votes go to one candidate. So if one vote goes, all the votes go. And proportional allocation is what the Democrats do, and that really started after 1968. And that is where a party primary is held, and as long as you receive something like 15% of the vote, then proportionally the percentage that you earn in a state goes towards the delegate total vote in your state. So for example, in a fictional state, and if it was candidate A and candidate B, candidate A gets 55% of the vote and candidate B gets 45% of the vote, then if there are, you know, say there's 50 delegate votes in that state, then, you know, candidate A would get 27 of those votes, and candidate B would get 23 of those votes. Okay, so that's kind of how proportional allocation works. So in some ways, it becomes much harder to rack up a high vote total against your opponent than it is in the Republican Party, where they have a lot of unit rule states, not all of them. A lot of them are proportional too. But they have more unit rule states, certainly, and it becomes kind of easy after you win a few big states to rack up high totals. And those high totals are different in both parties. So whereas the Electoral College, everybody knows, is 538 votes and you need 270 to win, in the Democratic Party there are roughly 4,000 votes, and in the Republican Party there's about 2,000 votes. So in the Republican Party, you need something like 1,100 votes to win, and in the Democratic Party, you need 2,100 votes to win. But these are all just formal differences. They aren't substantive differences, really, or at least that one isn't. It's just a matter of how many people get to attend the convention. It's also just how the math kind of adds up. But it's not as if there are more people in one party or the other because of the number of delegates they elect. So that's what you're after in a party primary, is delegates. And if you can win the most delegates before getting to the convention and kind of run up those vote totals to a point where your candidate can't win, any opposing candidate can't win, then you want to be able to declare victory well before the party nomination convention. That's usually able to happen. The media is always speculating about a delegate fight, but that's almost never, that was unlikely to happen in 2016 or 2020, despite the fact that they seem to think that there would be one in the Democratic Party if Sanders didn't win, or if either in either case, or if Clinton didn't win, or if Clinton and Obama had too close of a vote total, or one of them refused to concede, something like that. And now to shift gears a little bit, besides the delegate count, you need to know, and the formal designations, in terms of campaigning, to be able later to run ads and form coalitions and craft your own message, you need money. And a lot of that money comes from political action committees or PACs. And in the past, it came from them, and it's really any organization, whether it's a political party or an employer or a labor union or an environmental interest group or any other kind of interest group, they can form what's called a political action committee. And the numbers I can't recall right now, but they're definitely in your book. They have to be something like any one individual can only contribute something like $5,000 or possibly $10,000 in an election cycle to any one political action committee. But they can they then can spend money on behalf of a lot of different campaigns, and they can funnel money to a lot of different campaigns, meaning the PAC can then donate to other PACs or donate to party committees. It's basically just this sort of vehicle for money to get into politics in a way that seems prohibitive because of all these other rules that used to exist. And those rules, when I say used to exist, meaning they existed for about 40 years, from the time of right after Watergate until about 10 years ago. And about 10 years ago, the Supreme Court pretty definitively equated the spending of money in the process of a political campaign to the very fundamental right of freedom of speech. And so they had hinted at this for about the same length of time, about 40 years, and they had danced around it, and they had declared various aspects of the Federal Election Campaign Act, which introduced some federal matching funds and public funds into the election process. The Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, sponsored by Senators John McCain and Russ Feingold at the time. These were all meant to be something of a limit on the amount of money that can permeate into presidential campaigns and any campaign, any federal election campaigns, because they saw that Watergate was a scandal that wouldn't have existed were it not for the need for all of this money to flow in to keep presidential campaigns competitive, which really doesn't exist at anywhere near the same level as it does in the U.S. anywhere else in the developed world. So it's a way that, especially now that the Supreme Court has now declared under Citizens United, you see I've left out the N right there, in that Supreme Court decision that President Obama was so critical of, they have fundamentally equated spending money with making political speech. And so the money is now free-flowing in presidential campaigns. But campaign finance reform is not the same as lobbying, and you know that anyone who's taken Gov 101, anything like an intro American government course, knows that lobbying, whereas campaign finance is where corporations and wealthy individuals try as much as they can to elect friendly people to office, lobbying is where they get to call upon those people, perhaps, or they just try to get people who are already in office to do things for them that are in their interest. And that's not necessarily just wealthy individuals and corporations, of course not, but they certainly are the most visible, the most well-connected, and the most effective in lobbying, and they certainly pour the most resources into lobbying to the point where, every retired member of Congress who doesn't go back and run for president is inevitably at least offered a job, even if they don't take it, as a lobbyist, to be able to quadruple or make 10 times their salary they did in Congress if they could just try to persuade their old friends to persuade them to act in the interests of their new employers. Anyway, so that's for another time. But you should also know that in the presidential debates and in forming coalitions, all of those things need money. We can talk more about presidential debates during class. But one thing I want you to keep in mind while you're thinking about, how a presidential campaign evolves with all of this constant need for money and media attention, not just in the invisible primary, but through the rest of the primary, how much does their message change? How much does it need to evolve? And by the time they are elected, what kind of a mandate do they actually have? Is it anything like the recognizable campaign they had at the beginning of the campaign, which is usually about 2 years ago? That's how long a presidential campaign takes. And when we get to the media chapter, I want you to think once more about a question that I'm going to bring up now, which is it good, fundamentally, is it a good idea for a democracy like ours to have such a central political figure elected every 4 years, subject to an election cycle that basically lasts about 2 years out of every 4? And so that's where horse race coverage comes in, and that's where the money and the media attention come in, because so much of it is personality driven. How much of that election cycle really does address the policy issues that actually affect most people's lives. Okay, that's all from me for now. Hopefully you watch this before class and we can talk more about it then. Thanks very much. Thanks for watching.